how do we position ourselves to be successful, to drive the transformation that's necessary from an institutional capacity, to be able to leverage innovations that are occurring and deliver the outcomes that we're expecting for the students.
This is In the Know with ACCT, the voice of community college leaders. I'm Jacob Bray. This episode of In the Know features a conversation my colleague David Connor and I had with Keith Myers. Keith is the Senior Vice President for Client Development at CampusWorks. We talked about campus IT strategy in the context of student success-focused imperatives and data-informed decision-making, among other things. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode. We're picking up with discussion of the value of redesigning and reimagining institutional processes.
I'm actually excited hearing you talk about reimagining and redesigning. Working in communications in the education sector, there's always a lot of jargon that's thrown around that becomes kind of trendy. There's paradigm shifts was kind of an older one, and then it's disruptive innovation, and these terms just sort of, at least in my view, sometimes neutralize what it was originally meant by them. And so I like seeing these terms reimagining and redesigning because they're less commonly thrown around, but also because I had the privilege, I would say, and I mean that sincerely, of seeing your colleague, Liz Murphy, facilitate a strategic planning for a board. And it was, I have to be honest, I thought the strategic planning process was going to be pretty simple and straightforward and just come out with some kind of guiding principles. And she was very assertive in getting people to reimagine. She encouraged them to go beyond, way beyond what they thought was even realistic, to go as far as they could, and then to pull back and come up with think about it first and come up with some realistic planning. So thinking about reimagining and redesigning future processes, why is that specifically so important for colleges? I mean, community colleges in particular, they have in some ways a lot more limitations than some of them. There's a broad array of colleges and available resources, but specifically that reimagining and redesigning part, it doesn't necessarily require a whole lot of money, right? It's imagination. So how can you help colleges do that?
Yeah, and I think that the challenge for many institutions is we are so busy focused on the problems that exist every day that we don't really have the opportunity to step back and look at how do we do what we do every day. And I think when we get engaged with institutions, what we push them on is we ask the very simple question: if you were starting your college over again today, knowing what you know, how would you do it differently? And I think that elicits sometimes a very interesting response from colleges. It starts with the perspective of, first there's sort of a pause of, I hadn't sort of thought about it that way. We've sort of thought about, well, we do it this way today, and so we want to think about doing it in a slightly different fashion. But we all have those moments in our days where we think to ourselves, boy, if I just wasn't bound by today's challenge, I would do this completely different, or if I could start over. And I think what's interesting about a potential migration from an ERP perspective is it does afford you the opportunity to ask that question in a very serious capacity, and gives you the actual opportunity to answer it in a way that is an achievable outcome. And so when we start with the question of, if you're starting your organization over today, knowing what you know, how would you do it differently? It starts to become a very interesting conversation at a trustee level. It starts to become a very interesting conversation at an administration level, and seeps down into each of the individual activities. So how do you deal with financial aid today? How do you deal with a registration or engagement of employees? All of those aspects. And then as we engage institutions, as you noted, we really push on not just accepting the first answer as the answer. but really pushing on, okay, that's great, but what about this? And have you thought about this? And why not? Why shouldn't we be willing to strive for a very unique and different approach to the organization? And I think the second piece that really goes into it is helping staff who in some organizations may have been in their roles equally as long as the technology's been there, who maybe don't have as great a perspective on what's been the evolution of the work that gets done, or those folks that have maybe innovated in new ideas and concepts. This affords them the opportunity to step out of their day-to-day and really engage in a conversation of, I don't know if this is possible, but this is what I would like it to be. And then we can marry that in with ideas that bring together the concepts of development of a set of future state process maps that then also help you understand, as you go down the path of evaluating the technology, are we making the right decision in this process?
So I think that's interesting because a lot of us tend to relate things to ourselves personally. In the association world, we have something called an AMS. We have our own acronyms, Association Management System, and it's a pretty comprehensive information management system. We have had the same one here at ACCT for a very, very long time, and in part it's because it's just such a kind of a burden, even thinking about picking another one. There's so many options. We don't know exactly what we need. What we have may be more than we need, but this whole process of evaluating what we need is intimidating. It really is. And I have to say, one of my coworkers has been very assertive with telling us we need to do it. You just have to do it. Do the work. And so I'm very grateful for her because she's pushing us through, our own self-imposed barriers. Evaluation. Where do you even start? And particularly a trustee who gets regular updates. The institution has investigated a lot of different solutions and conducted a competitive bidding process. Now what? Can you explain that process?
Yeah, and I think for us, what we often advise colleges on is the concept that as an organization, there are things that you do that make you very unique for who you are. It's what draws the students to want to attend the institution. It's what draws the staff and the administration to continue to work for the institution. My analogy that I usually use is sort of this concept of the iceberg, right? There are things above the water that very much define what the iceberg is and what it looks like. And yet there are, as we know in the analogy, there are a million things that go on below the water that you never see, that don't actually have a great impact on what you perceive the iceberg to be. I think in this case it's very similar from an institution perspective. As you begin down this process, and as you step through really understanding what are the requirements that we have as an organization, where do we have pockets of challenge that may exist where we've got staff or technology or business processes that have been in their positions for longer than they ought to, where we may have efficiencies, where we may be missing the challenges that we have. As we start to define who we are as an organization, what is our portion of the iceberg that sticks above the water, how do we make sure that we are capturing all of that so as we wade into the evaluation process, we're sure that the technology that you're acquiring meets those needs. And so I think as you think about whether you're an association, whether you're a college, it is ensuring that you have a very good understanding of who you are as an organization. And it's weird to say that because I think if you were to ask most CEOs, they would say, I have a very good understanding of who I am as an organization. But when you get down to the very individualized level of how do you do function X or function Y, it's very, very different than knowing at a macro level who we are as an organization. And so from a trustee's perspective, I think it really comes down to ensuring that you have your finger on the perspective that the administration is being very thoughtful about the questions that they're asking. They're focused on how to ensure that whatever solution they are evaluating meet both the above the water needs and the below the water needs, as well as ensuring that as you bring the teams together to do the evaluation, there is consensus across the organization about the decision making that has to happen. And so one of the things that CampusWorks is incredibly proud of is throughout our work with colleges, and I think we're up to 35 or 40 of these, we've never worked with an institution that hasn't come to a unanimous decision about what technology they ought to select. And we do that not because it's a function of the fact that we're getting everybody to agree to the right solution. It's more about that you follow a process that leads to the decision that becomes very evident when you get to the end, because you've been very thoughtful about who you are as an institution. You've been very thoughtful about what do you need to do to be successful. You've been very thoughtful about what will need to happen to ensure the organization can make the transition. And ultimately you get to a position where it becomes easy to make the decision. And why that's important is because for those folks that are reluctant about the change, we're now all in this together to ensure that we're going to be successful as we move forward.
I know from working with our members that we do have a lot of member trustees who are very change oriented. They're very interested in the idea of making significant changes when necessary or useful at their institutions. Of course, there are some who are more resistant to change, maybe a little more conservative insofar as wanting to, not fix something that isn't broken. So, to what extent should trustees probe about the solution provider's ability to support change across the institution? This sort of implementation is going to be a major undertaking, and they'll need to make sure that people are supported as systems are changing, and that everybody understands how things are going to work in the interim, and then when things are said and done.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess also one thing that comes to mind is how long can when a change like this takes place, is there any estimated kind of lifespan on how long the new system may be in place, or is it just very open-ended? And
Yeah, I mean, I think from a trustee's perspective, it probably is not getting too concerned or focused on the individual feature functionality. That's probably more the purview of the administration. But from a trustee's perspective, I would think our advice to them is often to think about sort of three areas. First, as the institution's looking to partner with an institution, are they partnering with an institution that they feel very confident about their ability to not only sustain the work that they're doing, but also to be thoughtful and mindful about the future of the organization? And so, the challenges that are today will be very different than the challenges that may be 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. And so we want to make sure that the institution partners with someone that they believe they have a degree of confidence in their ability to evolve with the challenges that are coming through the organization. I think the second piece is how well the partner thinks about the aspects of delivery that drive to the ability to actually achieve transformation. And so it looks at things like how easy is it to access the underlying data, to be able to answer the questions that often arise, or to tackle the complex problems that are occurring when it may not necessarily be evident that we are asking the right question or we are focused in the right direction. the ability to access the data in the system in a way that is more data informed. And if we go back to the original conversation we had at the beginning, and the ability to impart that data to a trustee's perspective, to be able to say, are we focused in the right direction? And then I think the third thing is the ability for the institution to represent themselves and who they think they want to become as they focus on that student success initiative. Many of the platforms that are out there today are pushing exponentially on increasing the ability of the institution to have near-time or real-time interaction with students. I think it's very different than maybe when we went to school, where we maybe heard from the institution once or twice and we were sort of on their own. That constant flow of information becomes an incredibly important aspect, whether it's around retention or outcomes, and the ability of the system to support that consistent level of engagement with the student becomes a really important aspect of how you focus on making sure you are picking the right partner, especially from a trustee's perspective, where this may be a 7 or 8 figure investment, could be possibly the largest investment outside of a capital project. I want to make sure that we're picking the partner who could be around for the next 20, 25 years, because that's how long the current system's been around.
That's a while.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's a big investment. So, with that in mind, one of the primary things that makes people not actually go through with these things is potential pitfalls or problems that will come up during the implementation phase, and then you have to question everything. So can you help trustees understand what warning signs they can look out for when things are being implemented, and how to know if something actually has gone off track or if there may just be a normal hiccup in the implementation? I suspect sometimes you discover things that had not been planned for but are not necessarily catastrophic. That's just part, it's like building a house.
Yeah.
Things go wrong and
Right.
you fix them as they go wrong. How do you know if it's a real problem or just a normal problem?
Yeah, and I think what we often talk with institutions about is sort of the old adage of project management has always been on time and on budget. In the case of an ERP implementation, I think we focus on thinking a little broader than that, not just on time and on budget, but how are you exceeding the expectations, and are you able to achieve the transformation that you were looking for? And I think some of those are hard to quantify, right? On time and on budget is fairly easy. You defined a schedule and you defined a budget when you start out at the beginning of the process. For our partner institutions that we work with, and those institutions that are successful going through an ERP implementation, the amount of prep work that goes into all of the activities before you ever make a decision to do the implementation helps to minimize those surprises. It's not the sort of we showed up and decided we were going to build a house and didn't realize it was on quicksand sort of approach. And so those become important in terms of driving that on time, on budget by not generating those surprises. I think where the institution and where the trustees want to ask questions of the administration is, we often are told throughout the evaluation, selection, and implementation process, we're doing this to be able to drive a myriad of success factors, whether it's meeting the strategic goals, whether it's improving student outcomes, whether it's being able to become a more data-informed decision-making organization. And I think helping to quantify from an institutional perspective, what are those expectations that we're hoping to achieve? As we go through the evaluation process, how do we believe those expectations will be met by the solution we're picking? And then the achieving transformation part of that becomes really a function of how are we ensuring that the people in the institution are actually embracing the change that has to happen. So it's great to spend time talking about process reimagine and redesign. It's great to spend time talking about how you want to change and how you align to the goals. But when the rubber hits the road, if folks are not willing to actually sit down and think very differently and act very differently, then you're sort of missing that achieved transformation. And what we often find, CampusWorks as an organization routinely gets called into projects that have struggled. And what we see in sort of the Monday morning quarterbacking is you very quickly sort of abandon the achieves transformation, you abandon quickly the exceeds expectations, and we sort of get to the point of declaring it was either on time or on budget, and that equals project success. And I think from a trustee's perspective, it's continually asking the question, not just necessarily where are we in relation to the schedule and the budget, but where are we in terms of accomplishing the vision we had for the reason we undertook this project and spent the money.
Are there any other, is there anything else you'd like to add? Just generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one of the most important pieces that we often advise institutions is to think very specifically about the ability of engaging folks like CampusWorks. Doesn't have to be us, but thinking very broadly about the fact that this is a pretty long journey. From the point of interest to the declaring victory, and having someone who's been involved in the process, whether that's an administration who has lived through this at another institution before they arrived, or having an outside entity, either an individual or a company, who can help advise you on this path forward, becomes an incredibly important resource to answer the questions and to ensure that we're not making bad decisions as we go through building the house that we're going to come to regret later on in the process and have to go back and unwind. I think the other piece of this is really, from a trustee's perspective, is continually asking the question of the administration of what are we hoping to accomplish with this? Because those goals may change over time, but we want to ensure they're always aligned back to the strategic vision and those sort of big, hairy, audacious goals that we talked about at the beginning are being met as you go through what is a very complex and often stressful time for the institution. So.
If people want to learn more about the work that you're doing or have any other questions, is there a resource that you want to direct them towards?
Yeah, certainly. So, CampusWorks as an organization, certainly you can visit our website at www.campusworksinc.com, as well as Educause has a wealth of resources around ERP migration. ACCT provides insights in terms of the governance structures that go into it. There's an ERP playbook that exists on our website that gives additional insights into a lot of what we talked about today that would be helpful for trustees. And then the other piece is really reaching out to peer trustees who've been through the process before to what lessons they learned in this.
This has been part 2 of our 2-part series with Keith. The resources we discussed at the end of this episode will be linked in the description. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.